Tashkent is Uzbekistan, isn't it? Hello there, and a very warm welcome to the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair, and indeed to this great session here, Reading Between the Lines, the Diplomatic Tightrope. So we have a great session for you today. I'm Atna Trainer, and I'm delighted to welcome author Jennifer Stile. Jennifer is joining us from Tashkent in Uzbekistan, and there she is. Jennifer, great to see you.
It's great to see you.
And we'll check on the sound in just a minute here. We don't quite have it ready, but it'll certainly, they'll fix on that.
So can you not hear me?
There you are. Yes, yes, yes. How lovely we have you in place. Wonderful. And also, we're joined by former U.S. diplomat, author, and of course leading expert on Saudi Arabia, David Rondell. So David, thank you so much for being here in person with us.
Pleasure.
Now, as you're expecting, we have two great speakers here, and the title of this is Reading Between the Lines, the Diplomatic Tightrope. Now, David, if I might start with you, you're a career diplomat. If you can maybe take us back a little bit. You studied Arabic at Oxford, so clearly you had an eye on this region, without a doubt, from an early age. You weren't going to head off to Latin America if you spoke good Arabic, probably not. But talk to me about your work in the U.S. Foreign Service, and has it actually lived up to your expectations?
Yes, my work in the Foreign Service definitely met my expectations and was a lot of fun. Most of the days I went to work, it wasn't work. So I was, I think it was Buddha who said, if you enjoy what you're doing, you never go to work. And I have to say that was the case for me. Most of the time, it was very interesting. I had both interesting colleagues to work with in the embassies and interesting people that I met, and you got to some extent, be a fly on the wall to see history being made. I wouldn't say that I made, well, in some ways, in certain instances, you could argue that we made history. So yeah, it was an interesting experience, and it lived up to my expectations, yes.
Now, Jennifer, you really had no intention of getting sort of caught up in diplomatic life. That was never your early intention. And while it wasn't quite an accident, it was a very wonderful encounter, actually, that has you now involved in this. And while you're not a professional diplomat, you have had to adjust life as an ambassador's wife. Talk to us about that transition in terms of, almost becoming part of this.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here with you, Edna, and with you, David. So thank you very much for having me here. I'm excited to be back at the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair, so thank you. First of all, I had no intention of becoming an ambassador's wife. That was not in my plans. I was a journalist. I was a writer. I worked in the theater as an actor. So I've been working for a news magazine in the United States, working in New York, when by another fortuitous accident, I ended up running a newspaper in Yemen, a Yemeni-owned newspaper called the Yemen Observer. I was invited to come be the editor-in-chief of that newspaper, and that is what took me abroad for the first time. So I left the U.S. in 2006 and have not lived there since, because what I thought was going to be a one-year position running this newspaper turned into a book, which turned into a marriage, which turned into a child and a second book, and then a third and several more countries. So it was a very strange transition for me. I lived in a tiny little flat in Manhattan. I have worked my entire life since I was 16. I did not aspire to wifehood. That was not even something I thought about. I wanted to write. I was really focused on kind of my work, almost to the exclusion of everything else. And so running the newspaper in Yemen took everything I had, because I had to learn the culture. I was learning Arabic. I was learning about Yemeni in my neighborhood, Yemenis in my neighborhood from my reporters who were all Yemeni. I lived in the old city of Sana'a, which is the most beautiful city in the world. The Yemenis are the friendliest people I've ever met in my entire life. I lived alone in the old city. I felt looked after. I felt welcomed. It was an incredible year. So I was really wrapped up in that and really not expecting to fall in love with anyone while I was there. I was busy. But I did meet my husband there after I'd been there for a year. And when I first moved in with him, there was a lot to adjust to. First of all, he had 10 bodyguards. Spontaneity was not part of our life. So there was a lot of notice they needed before we could leave the house. So at first, before I was official, if we needed butter while we were cooking something, I had to run out and buy it, because if you were going to run out and buy it, 10 guys would have to suit up. So it was much easier for me to do it. I'd also, as someone who's never in her entire life had a house cleaner or anything like that, to suddenly have staff in the house was a major adjustment. I felt really uncomfortable about it at first. I felt I was in an unearned position of privilege, which I was. It is an unearned position of privilege that I was in, and I wasn't quite sure how to manage that. And when I was asked kind of, what would you like for lunch? I said, oh, no, I'll just make myself a sandwich, until my husband finally said, you have to let them do their job. This is their job. But it has been a big adjustment. I had no idea what was expected of me, and I had every intention of continuing to work full-time in my own career. And so it took me a while to sort out how being married to Tim was going to affect my career and my writing, and what kinds of things I could no longer write about now that I was married to a diplomat. I hope that wasn't too long. I'm very sorry.
Well, we've lots to talk about. I might get the sound turned up a little bit if the guys, our technical people, are listening, and we'll just make sure that we have it on an even level. And again, a question that I'll put to perhaps both of you too. David, I mean, you really need an open mind to do this job, I think, if nothing else. I mean, is there room as a diplomat for any preconceived notions or prejudices, or do we all naturally have these? And when you look back on your career, and you look around at other diplomats too, in terms of coming with preconceived notions of how a country works, how it's run, and maybe what they could do better.
Well, I think that it's dangerous to arrive with preconceived notions that are hardwired into your mind. I think it's impossible not to have some preconceived notions, but it's important not to let them override what you see and observe. So you should try to arrive with not a blank slate. You want to have some knowledge of the country, but you want to arrive with an open mind. So I think that's important, and I work quite hard to keep an open mind. I've been studying Saudi Arabia now for over 30 years, and so I've written a book on the subject. So it's easy for me to conclude that I figured it out and that I know what's happening, and I think that's very dangerous. So every day when I'm working on things in Saudi Arabia, I force myself to question my own assumptions. And I think that that's important for everyone to do. So the answer to your question is yes, everybody has preconceived notions. That it's important to keep them in check.
And Jennifer, when you came to, coming from the US and coming to Yemen, this is quite a transition. We're really talking about very different lifestyles. Again, talking about, your viewpoint, how you was going to happen when you arrived in Yemen, and you talk to me a little bit too, again, about how you have to create that cultural adjustment in many ways.
Yes, so when I arrived in Yemen, I did arrive with no preconceptions about the country, because I didn't know very much about it. I had started studying Arabic, but this job came about quite suddenly, and I wasn't given much time to prepare for this move across the world. So I just kind of moved almost spontaneously to Yemen, where I was very clear on the fact that I needed to learn things constantly, and I was I didn't come with specific ideas about Yemen. and I learned about Yemen, and I would never say that I became an expert on anywhere we've lived. You know, exactly as David was just saying, I'm constantly questioning my assumptions about anywhere. And I think what living outside of the US has done for me is forced me to examine how the US shaped me and my American assumptions about how the world works. I think that it's difficult to understand how the US has shaped you if you never leave it. And I think when you leave it and you are you are confronting countries and cultures that have completely different assumptions about the world and how it works and how it should work. It forces you to say, oh, hey, I made this assumption I wasn't aware that I was making. So it is a continual learning process. You never become part of the country you're in. No matter how long you live there, you are always an outsider. You can study forever. I mean, we were in Yemen for 4 years, and we were just touching the first outer layer of the complicated onion that is Yemen. So.
Yeah, I do want to start talking about the books in a minute, but just staying with our title here, because indeed it all is part and parcel. And David, yes, Saudi Arabia is where we really want to get a little bit more understanding from you and talk about your book. But when you look again about being a diplomat in terms of how things have changed, really, do you think the whole concept has lost perhaps a bit of the formalities that were once there in terms of actually being a diplomat and delivering the job you had to do in a country or here in the Middle East or anywhere?
First, I should add one other element of my job which I enjoyed. And you asked that question, and I should have mentioned that it allowed my family to see a lot of interesting places, and it allowed my daughter to grow up in a very much more cosmopolitan environment than she would have experienced had we lived for 20 years in any one place. So
or
while
in the
that
US
has its
particularly,
strengths,
as Jennifer was saying
it has its strengths and its weaknesses, but it is, I think, overall a very positive experience for my family. In terms of how the diplomacy has changed, and I keep thinking I have to look up here to the screen to see Jennifer. I don't want to turn my back on Jennifer.
Okay.
Diplomacy has changed in a number of ways. I mean, for one, it is definitely less formal. The intake now is far broader in terms of the socio and economic class from which the people are chosen. I mentioned to you the other day that I was looking through the Foreign Service exams from the 1920s. And in those days, what you had to know to pass the test to become a diplomat was to know who wrote which opera. That's not on the exam anymore. So the background of the people has changed. It's much more diverse. It's much more representative of the United States and the population in general. And the work has changed as well in really, I would say, two ways. First of all, the independence of the people in an embassy has been very much restricted. They now receive instructions directly from Washington, telling them what they should say, what they should not say. If they have a question, they relay that. They provide background information, but the decisions really are made by other people. And if it's a really important issue, you will find people from Washington getting on the plane and coming to discuss it. So to that extent, the independence and to some extent the importance of people in an embassy has been reduced. The other thing which has changed in the embassy is that there used to be pretty much everyone in the embassy was in the Foreign Office, or what we call the State Department. Today they are a small minority. The overwhelming number of people, when I left the American Embassy in Riyadh, the mission, which is the embassy and 2 consulates, we had 800 people in our staff, 800, okay? The great majority of them were not State Department, and that's not counting the military. That's the separate thing. These are civilians. And so these 800 people represented a very wide range of other agencies. And to some extent, the State Department became sort of the innkeeper, if you will, for these others. So we have people from the Justice Department, from the Agriculture Department, from the Energy Department, I mean, you name it, from the Homeland Security Department. So the nature of an embassy has changed both for the State Department political people and also in the sense that the embassy itself is now a much bigger family. All those people have some work to do there, but it's very different than when I first joined. And
Jennifer, when we look at, and right beside you I can see your book, The Ambassador's Wife, and this is a story it's a fiction, it's a novel that you wrote, but clearly based on some of your own experiences and that. But also when you look at your role as the ambassador's wife, and indeed anybody who works that close, you know, there may be a misconception out there that it's all a great social life and grand parties, and but again, all of this has a great purpose in terms of what you're doing there and the people you're meeting and the information that you're exchanging. Talk to me a little bit about that and why that's so important.
I would love to. So first, I should probably clarify that my husband is a British ambassador, not American. So just wanted to make that clear. So most of what I know about diplomacy is how the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office does it. The State Department operates very differently. So there are different kinds of foreign offices.
Of course.
So anyway, just for background. Also, you know, just to kind of add something to that last conversation about whether it's gotten less formal, the role of the ambassador's partner, whether it's a man or a woman, has become a lot less formal, at least in our world, because being an ambassador's wife used to be a job. It used to be something that wives did full time. Now, I had no interest in that job. I had a job. So nowadays, that's more likely to be the kinds of things ambassadors' wives used to do has now been given to someone in the embassy, and it's a separate job because more partners are working full time. But so you talked about socializing with a purpose, and I think that there is, I very rarely meet people who actually know what ambassadors or diplomats do in the day-to-day life. They have this illusion that it's cocktail parties and dinners and a lot of frivolity, which has not been my personal experience with it. Generally, if you're inviting people to an event, say a dinner or drinks, you're inviting them to listen to them. So when we invite human rights activists to our home for dinner, we're inviting them because we want human rights activists, in this case Uzbek human rights activists, to tell us what they see as their biggest human rights issues and to tell us how they would like or not like the UK to help them. So it's really important, I believe, to be listening to the local people and responding to that, and not to be moving into a country and saying, here's how we think we should help you. Us with our white Western viewpoint, you know, we want to listen to, all right, what do the people actually want help with? If that makes sense.
Yes, and David, again, you know, and you had mentioned to me the concept of, what is it, you have 2 ears and one mouth, and you
yes,
should
that's right.
use them proportionately, so to speak. Talk to me again about, you know, how that probably is good advice as a diplomat.
Yeah, well, first I would echo what Jennifer said, is that in the American Foreign Service, really even when I joined, your evaluation carried a box as to how well your wife was performing her function as, you know, a hostess. And a community figure. So she, and this was, she obviously wasn't getting paid for this. So eventually, so they had to stop that. They couldn't really, they couldn't expect that they were paying one salary and getting two workers. So they said, if you want to hire my wife, that's fine, but otherwise she's not here to entertain people. But that changed. To answer your question, yes, I think that the role of a diplomat is to encourage, really is to encourage harmonious relations between countries, just to say between the established governments of those countries. And if that cannot happen for whatever reason, than to preserve and protect the interests of, in our case, the United States and our allies. And it's not our job to evangelize our values to other societies. Now, in that case, that is my view. There are people in the State Department, particularly in Democratic administrations, who take exception to that, who believe it is our job to evangelize our values. I subscribe to the views of our President John Adams, who said that we are the friends of liberty everywhere, but the champions only of our own. We go not abroad seeking monsters to slay. So I take that as my motto, and I think there are many people in the Foreign Service who do, although I have to say there is a division of opinion in some administrations see it differently. In terms of listening or speaking, I think that clearly you're there to listen, as Jennifer said, and to try and understand. It's rather difficult to speak about a country you don't really understand, and it's difficult to understand until you've been there a long time and listened a lot. So I would agree with that.
Now, Jennifer, talk to me about what you would call white savior complex. And I know at the moment you have a few great books written already, and you're working on your PhD. You have so much going on, but I can, sort of see this concept of white savior complex if we perhaps look at Western, maybe not necessarily diplomats, but Western people, coming to, various, particularly probably developing countries and that. But talk to us a little bit about what your perception and your understanding is on this.
Yes, I just scribbled a note while David was talking as I was nodding along with a lot of what he was saying. I wrote down, the world is not a place upon which we should project our ego. And I think that there are a lot of people who travel to other countries thinking they're going to save these people from themselves, and which is built on the assumption that we know better what's good for them than they do, which is an insult to the agency of the people that you want to quote unquote help. And so I think this is really common. And I think it's taken me a while to kind of, I'm in my third year of a PhD program right now in creative writing, but a lot of it is studying white savior complex and its representation in literature and in critical thought, as well as feminism and gender and other things. But I feel like, here's the thing. You write your first book, and it's your first book, and you write it at the time when you write it, and then you learn things along the way. And with each successive book, I feel like I have learned more about the world, and my worldview has become less tethered to the United States, I hope, and more kind of untethered entirely. You're never untethered entirely. That's a pipe dream. But I guess that's my ultimate goal. And so, the problem is once something's in print, it's in print forever, but you develop as a writer and a person. And so I feel like there may be perspectives that I exhibit in my first book that I would rewrite now. And that's hard. I always want to edit everything I've ever written and forever. So thank goodness for deadlines. But so it is kind of, your brain is always way ahead of your last published book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, and talking, let's get to talk about these great books that you've both written. And David, vision or mirage? You look at a country like Saudi Arabia. This, is really where your big expertise is. Yes, in the Middle East, but particularly in Saudi. And of course, you were there at a time when you started there. It was very different from what is happening in Saudi now. Perhaps bring us through some of the changes, and even the ones you talk about in your book, in terms of now, I suppose, the speed of adaptation, and talk to us in terms of how things have changed so much since you went to Saudi Arabia in the beginning.
Well, I went there 40 years ago for the first time. And the biggest change since then really has been in the living standard and the economic infrastructure of the country. When I went there, it was still quite a It was primitive. I mean, it was simple. When I first got there, there was no paved road from Jeddah to Riyadh. It wasn't completely finished. So the quality of life, the education, the health care, the housing, all of those things dramatically changed. What didn't change was the social norms of the country, which remained very different from the rest of the world. And that is probably what has changed the most in the last 5 years, in the sense that, particularly as relates to gender, the fact that women can now drive, the fact that dress codes are now less restrictive, the fact that girls can go to take sports, that the guardianship regulations, which was a complicated system that basically meant that women had to have the permission of their husband or their father to do many things, from opening a bank account to starting a business to traveling abroad. Most of that has been dismantled. So in terms of gender, things have changed very rapidly, very dramatically, and in the direction of global norms. The social change has gone beyond gender, in the sense that there now is the religious police have been by and large defanged, if you will. That's a term people tend to use. Let's say their prerogatives have been reduced substantially. Movie theaters have been permitted, which there were no movie theaters. The mixing of the genders in restaurants is now essentially permitted, as is music. Music was essentially forbidden in public places. So all of those things have changed quite rapidly and quite dramatically.
And Jennifer, I've just been reading, your wonderful book here, The Woman Who Fell from the Sky, and I see it there behind you as well. But just a beautiful read, and also just lovely, lovely stories in there. Particularly, when we think of you being brought in as an American to work in Yemen at the newspapers. So clearly there was an appetite to have perhaps a different viewpoint, or was it something that you felt you came to do for a while? I mean, did you see it actually having a lasting impact? Did they want it to have a lasting impact? And did, I suppose, your journalists, and we really get to know them in this book too, in terms of their development and how they're working. But is this something, are they at liberty to actually take on, I suppose, a new attitude as a result of somebody like yourself coming in to work with them?
Well, I think that was probably the hope of the man who hired me, the Yemeni man who hired me. So I did not seek this job. This job came to me and lassoed me and dragged me off to Sana'a. So it was not something that I actually considered myself qualified to do, to be honest. In fact, I said that to the editor. I went over there to train journalists. That was my initial goal. That's what they wanted me to come do. So I went over there and I trained journalists for 3 weeks, and it was the most exciting 3 weeks I'd ever had. I loved the journalists. I had an equal number of men and women working for me. I'd never been around people who were so ambitious and eager to learn and just completely open-minded and welcoming. And I think the reason that Ferris decided he wanted me to take over the paper and to run it for a year is he really, at the time, there was no real professional training for journalists. So at the time, also, each newspaper was aligned with a political party. There was absolutely no tradition of having what we called objective journalism. But I studied journalism at Columbia, and that's what they taught us. You get at the truth, whatever that is. You never align yourself with anyone. You find the truth and the facts to support it, to support whatever you're saying in the article. And so my reporters, when I first got there, had not figured out what was a legitimate source and what wasn't. So they believed everything they read on the internet. They didn't use sources in their stories. They included a lot of opinion. And so a lot of what I did was just teach them how to report and how to ask questions. I mean, this was a culture that didn't teach questioning. The learning in the schools was very much memorization and rote learning. They weren't taught critical analytical thinking, and they weren't taught to question people in power of any kind. So even when one of my reporters had to question a doctor for a medical story she was writing, she didn't want to ask the doctor questions. And I said, well, if you're going to be a reporter, you actually have to ask people questions. That's the only reason you're going to find out anything. And then, so that was what I was there to do, was kind of to teach them the basics of how to be a journalist, kind of similar to how I would teach it anywhere, except it was in a completely different culture. And there were a lot of things I learned along the way. Like, it took me a long time to figure out how to understand why they didn't want to ask questions, and to work with them on making that easier for them. And to also find ways for my women to report without having to be alone anywhere with a man, which was not okay in their culture. So, and just learning how to work within their culture. So I learned I had to learn a lot more than they had to learn from me. But so that's why, that was their goal in hiring me. I think, Ferris wanted legitimacy with his newspaper. Whether or not we achieved that, it was short-lived. I think the paper's now deceased, unfortunately, but I think the goal was to have it be lasting. And in fact, I trained my successor with an eye to it being lasting. But, there was a real problem with how my successor worked with the female journalists. For example, I was not considered a woman when I was there. They thought of me as a third sex. They thought of me as a giraffe or, a chandelier, but someone who wasn't sexed or gendered in the same ways that women there were. So that was interesting. So while they wouldn't want to take, they wouldn't want one of their Yemeni newsroom colleagues to be their boss, they were fine with me being their boss, and that was an interesting observation.
Tell me, when did you decide that you wanted to write a book about, teaching these journalists? And lovely stories unfold in the book, and, yes, this book had to be written, without a doubt. But when did you actually decide, from your professional role there to the fact that this was indeed a great story to tell?
I think actually from my first week there, my first day there was so eventful and so full of crazy adventures that I thought first of all, everyone in the US at the time, if they knew anything about Yemen, and most people I talked to did not, they didn't know what part of the world it was in, they didn't know what language that they spoke, and if they knew anything, they thought, oh, they're just a bunch of terrorists, aren't they? Whereas I found the opposite to be true in terms of my personal experience with Yemenis. They were hands down the friendliest culture I've ever come in contact with. And I've never felt so immediately welcomed anywhere. And so I took notes every single morning. So every single morning I got up super early and I wrote for at least an hour over coffee before going to work, because I often didn't get home till 3 a.m. and I knew it wasn't going to happen after work. So I get up and write for an hour, and then I had documents open on my desktop at work so that I could record interesting things that happened kind of as the day went on, because I wanted to make sure I had accurate quotes, that I had accurate information about each day, because so much happened every day that I knew I'd forget it. And so I wanted to, I wrote this explicitly for an American audience because I wanted Americans to know the Yemenis that I knew. I wanted them to experience the Yemenis in my newsroom, to experience, their ambition and their intelligence and their sense of humor and kind of the hilarity that we had in the newsroom every day. And this wasn't something that a lot of people seem to know about. And it was important to me that people not think of Yemenis as terrorists, that they think of them as individual humans who are not a homogenous group. Each one of them is different, just as we all are.
Yes.
So I guess that's why I wrote it.
And David, clearly your book had to be written, and I think people who have, read it and reading through parts of it, it's a very balanced book, and this is what many of the reviews in the US are also saying. Not alone is it a very balanced book, but also suggesting that it is a book that every diplomat before they come to this part of the world should read. To have that appreciation, I think, of your book is very important too. But again, you often say too that Saudi Arabia is very misunderstood in terms of how, you know, outside people view it. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, I think that's correct. Saudi Arabia is a very unusual country, and it's very hard to access. So when you look at the fact that it is a monarchy, there are not many monarchies left in the world. When you look at the fact that it is a very theocratic society, a very deeply religious society, again, that is not common. When you look at the fact that it has essentially a distributive economy as opposed to a productive economy, they're trying to change that, but by and large, the living standard of the average Saudi is divorced from his productivity, and that's not the case in most countries. So those are very different things about Saudi Arabia. You combine that with the fact that up until very recently, you couldn't get a visa to go there. Their language is not easy to learn. And in many cases throughout their history, they weren't particularly welcoming. So they were poorly understood for a number of reasons. My goal was to help the United States make better foreign policy. And in order to do that, you needed to understand Saudi Arabia more than the caricatures that frequently prevailed. And so you had to explain, as Jennifer said, that, you know, they're not all terrorists, they don't all own oil wells, they don't all ride about on camels. I mean, they have the same perspective of the United States. You know, they would think that the United States is divided at the Mississippi River, and half of the people looked like Kojak in New York City, and the other half are the Marlboro Man riding around on his horse, and that's about their division of America. So they have caricatures too, but hopefully they're not trying to make their foreign policy based on the Marlboro Man. So that was the purpose of the book, and it was also, I think, early on in my career, I was faced with the issue of the stability of Saudi Arabia. The question of how does a monarchy survive in the 20th and 21st century? And just to be very quick about that, there's a picture that I'm very fond of that is of the funeral of King Edward. I guess he was King Edward VIII in around 1910 or something in London.
In London, okay.
And there is a photo, actually there was a movie, an early movie of the cortege following his coffin. And behind him are kings and dukes and archdukes and grand viziers. I mean, it's a whole cavalcade of people with fancy uniforms and medals and crowns, and they're all the heads of state of Europe, of Germany, of Austria, of the Ottoman Empire, of the Russian Empire, all kinds of dukes from Europe. And at the very, very end, walking in just a common black coat and a top hat, is the President of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt, because he was only a commoner, and he was at the end of the parade behind all these dukes. And I look at that picture and I think, wow, there was only one president then, and there were all these other kings and dukes. And then go look at a picture of the G20 meeting, whichever the one they just had, and who will you see there? One king left, King Salman, and the rest are all presidents and prime ministers, and no more dukes or emperors. So the world has changed quite dramatically, and the Saudis are the king of Saudi Arabia is in some ways the last man standing. So you kind of ask yourself, why is that? Is it a fluke? Is it going to continue? And I would argue that it's not a fluke, that there are very, very clear reasons why Saudi Arabia is different, and that it is changing but remains stable. And that's the essence of the book.
Now, we do have a few people in our physical audience, so if there's any questions, please, by all means, make sure that you let me know. Jennifer, I'd like to talk a little bit about, you know, I suppose, the stability of the many countries that you have been with, you know, with your husband, and also the personal security, I suppose. I mean, you yourself were kidnapped, not because of your affiliation, but being kidnapped is still no fun. It might, you know, years later give you some good material to write about, but at the time, I'm sure it certainly wasn't something that you enjoyed going through by any means. And also, of course, your husband was in a situation too where, you know, there was many threats. Talk to us a little bit about that in terms of, you know, how you deal with it, I suppose, at the time, and how it changes your life.
Right. So I was kidnapped when I was 6.5 months pregnant with my daughter, and I was hiking with 4 other women. And it's a story that I've told often since the first time, you know, after it happened and I made it home safely. I was required to write down exactly what happened for the Foreign Office. So I had written it, but I find that I write it with regularity, not because I want to. I have no interest in writing that story, but often whenever someone gives me, I don't know, if I'm doing a writing prompt with a group or something like that, I end up back there. And I feel like that's because writing is how I process everything. And I've noticed that, you know, the more I write about that experience, the shorter it gets, as if I'm trying to kind of make it fit into a smaller space. I mean, there was a time when we were being held that I was worried I was going to go into premature labor because of the trauma of being at the wrong end of 8 AK-47s. And I think being pregnant saved me, kept me from being hysterical, because I thought, okay, if I freak out, I'm losing this baby. That is what's going to happen. So even if we survive this situation, my daughter's not going to survive unless I calm down. So I did the only thing I knew how to do, which was yoga breathing, which finally came in useful. And that helped me kind of to calm down in that moment. But I think processing that experience, I mean, that happened in 2009 and it's 2021 and I still kind of have trouble breathing sometimes when I talk about it. Not always, sometimes I'm completely fine. And then my husband was attacked by a suicide bomber who blew himself up on his car and his head landed on the top of an 8-story building nearby. So had he not been in an armored car, he would not have survived. And as a result of that worsening security situation, my daughter and I were evacuated from Yemen and we had nowhere to go. We didn't have a home anywhere else. And I was alone with a 6-month-old infant, and that was not my plan for how things were going to go. So we moved to Jordan because it was a direct flight from Yemen, so with the hope that Tim could visit us. But since then, you know, that was not the only time we'd been evacuated. We were also evacuated from Uzbekistan and kept apart from my husband for 11 months. And I think something you don't realize when you marry a diplomat is that suddenly you can be forced to be apart from your family for almost a year with no say in the matter. And I find that a struggle. I mean, maybe we've been particularly unlucky and haven't been evacuated more than once, but I think there are lots of people who've been far more unlucky than we have. But I think finally the reason we finally bought a home, our permanent home is in France, is because so we'd have somewhere to go next time we got evacuated from somewhere. So I kept ending up in apartments here and there. That I had to find at the last minute.
Yeah, I can imagine that it's very unsettling too, without a doubt. It's unsettling for you, it's unsettling for the family. Come back, David, and let's talk about stability in this region, stability in Saudi Arabia, that relationship between Saudi Arabia and the US, how you see it changing in terms of importance perhaps. We look at what's going on in the oil markets, and we look at you know, a relatively buoyant oil industry in the US. Do they need to be great friends all the time in terms of, you know, your history, having been there, and what we move towards in the next few years?
That's a good question. I think Saudi Arabia was and remains a very important country and a critical ally for the United States. It's the largest Arab economy, and it remains geopolitically very strategic in its position, which is at the intersection between Asia, Africa, and Europe. So it's geographically important. It's also religiously important because a quarter of the Earth's population turn to Mecca 5 times a day, and the message that comes out of Mecca is listened to and resonates, and that could be either a radical or a moderate voice, and so that remains important. But the final point that you mentioned is oil, and Saudi Arabia remains the central bank of oil. It is the country that has the ability to increase or decrease production by large volumes, by fiat. Well, I think you were alluding to the fracking revolution in the United States. That has shifted the supply curve of petroleum products in the world. There is more oil. The likelihood that oil is going to reach $100 a barrel again, or $120 a barrel like it was a few years ago, anytime soon has been substantially reduced by the fracking revolution. Saudi's market share has been reduced. Renewable energy is becoming more important. All of that is true, but that doesn't change the fact that global oil demand continues to rise annually, and I anticipate that despite renewables and despite efforts at decarbonization, economic growth is going to see an increase in demand for oil, certainly for the next couple of decades. So Saudi Arabia remains important, and I think, again, you were alluding to the fact that while the United States does not import a great deal of Saudi oil, our key allies do. Japan, for one, South Korea, for another, are heavily dependent on the oil. Finally, oil is traded on a global market, so there's essentially a global oil price. If that price, if Saudi Arabia became unstable, if oil production in Saudi Arabia collapsed, and as it did, for example, in Iraq or in Libya, when Libya collapsed, that 1 million barrels went off market. If 10 million barrels went off, as in Saudi Arabia, you would feel that, you would see that, the entire world would see that. Even if the United States didn't go into a recession, our trading partners would, and that would affect us. So I think that people who argue that Saudi Arabia is less important today because we can now frack, they're missing quite a few points.
And again, do you think that, you know, in terms of the visibility and the changes that are happening in Saudi Arabia at the moment, David, that people are beginning to maybe understand the country a little bit more? Are Americans understanding it a little bit more? And perhaps they're traveling, you know, you look at Saudi Arabia opening up, and, you know, the pandemic didn't do it any favors right now, unfortunately. But I'm not sure will it be number one on the visa list for Americans. I'll come to you in a minute.
This question is for His Excellency.
Our sound is not the best, so if you can speak up a little bit.
Okay, now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. This question is for His Excellency, is regarding a woman diplomat. Imagine that you have a closest diplomat friend or even a daughter who is going to this part of the world as diplomat. Even if this professional will be for sure prepared to come here, what will be the best advices, plural, that you could give it to her as woman diplomat in the moment that she will be confronted to this part of the world, specifically Saudi Arabia, to try to accomplish the goals without too much little accidents regarding the gender?
Okay, I don't know, Jennifer, are you hearing our questions there? Again, an interesting question. Let David take it first, maybe.
Just to repeat, the question was, what advice would you give to a female diplomat going to Saudi Arabia?
Yeah.
5 years ago, my advice would be don't come. You're wasting your time and you're wasting the government's money. Because you couldn't do a lot. I mean, there were very strict, I mean, a woman could not even go into the Ministry of Defense. She certainly couldn't go into the Ministry of Hajj or Religious Affairs. She had to wear conservative dress, which offended some people. She certainly couldn't drive. And the number of women that she could speak to was fairly limited. And the number of women that I could speak to was fairly limited because women remained segregated. The first time I went to the city of Buraydah, this is a long time ago now, but I was literally in that city for 3 days and I did not see a woman. If I had come from Mars, I would have thought there is no such thing as women. It's a very, very closed society for women. That changed dramatically in the last 5 years. It's been changing for many years. I have a Saudi friend who's a little bit older than I am now, but he had numerous, like many Saudis, they have more than one wife, and so there are many children of different ages. And he said his oldest sister, his father told his sister that she was never allowed to go anywhere except to the mosque and the store. That was it. His youngest sister went to the University of Colorado to get a PhD. So that shows you within one family the kinds of transition that is happening. And so today there is an active, I guess you would call it an affirmative action program. I mean, it is an affirmative action program for women. Most of the restrictions on women in terms of the kinds of jobs they could get. They used to not be able to be engineers or geologists, pharmacists. There were a lot of things you couldn't be. That's gone. And women can now sit where they want. So I think the restrictions, I think it'd be a very interesting time to be a woman. I think I'd encourage a woman to go to Saudi Arabia now because you're part of a government-encouraged transformation. Things in Saudi Arabia happen mostly on a top-down fashion. And so the leadership of the country is now pushing an opening for women. And it would be an interesting time to be there. I would add only one caveat that if you go, and I think Jennifer would agree with this, that what you find in an urban center like Riyadh or Jeddah or Dhahran is different than you might find in some village.
Yes.
So if you are going to some remote village, you might want to remain a little bit more conservative and you would be treated differently. Yeah. But in the main centers where most of your diplomatic work is going to be done, I think you'll have a good time and be very interesting.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I've spent many visits to Saudi Arabia over the last 10 years, and I see such a drastic change. I'm not going there in a diplomatic context, but very much at big conferences, talking to ministers and various things like that, and talking to senior leaders in the country and in the city. But yes, as a city, we have to wrap it up. But Jennifer, I want to building on just what David was just saying there, in terms of living now as you do in Uzbekistan and perhaps another area, and many of the stands, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and Tajikistan and areas around there, that again, sometimes maybe go a little unnoticed, particularly to the Americans and to many people. What are you observing, the big changes that are happening there? And are you very optimistic in terms of the future for an area like that, just to wrap it up?
Right. Well, I have to start off by saying I am not an expert. I've been kind of wrapped up in my own studies, but it is really fascinating to be here because Uzbekistan is a Muslim country, but it's worlds away from the way Yemen was a Muslim country. And I think often people who have not lived in Muslim countries have this idea that they're all the same somehow. That couldn't be farther from the truth. And Islam here is so different from the way Islam was realized in Yemen, in that, well, of course, this is a country that lived under the USSR and communism for a very long time, and so their religion was outlawed and suppressed. And so while it's a Muslim country, the women don't cover, they walk around in miniskirts, they drink vodka, they work, and you could walk around and think it looks very Western in a lot of ways. But at the same time, and what's interesting, so it's going through this huge transition. I mean, first away from communism, but then also in the wake of Karimov, and there is this new kind of hope now that that dictator is no longer with us, that the country's opening up, and the people are becoming perhaps less fearful than they were under him. But at the same time, there also is a move in the young people towards more radical Islam. And it's interesting because like, for example, the places where I grew up, the kids tended to be more secular than the adults. And here it seems to be the reverse, because the adults grew up more secular and the kids are watching YouTube videos and becoming radicalized that way. So it'll be interesting to see what direction the country takes. We talk to a lot of journalists, and it's interesting to listen to their take, because of course they are far better positioned to understand what's going on in the country than we are. So I think it's a really interesting time to be here. I mean, a lot has happened in the last 10 years here as well. I mean, there weren't coffee shops or gathering places before Karimov died, and now it's quite lively.
Yeah.
So.
And as you said, yes, indeed, a fascinating time, and also to be there, to be an observer in terms of what's going on as well. David, I'm leaving you the last word here. We have to wrap it up. Just your hopes for the future in terms of where Saudi Arabia is positioned. They've got a big agenda. They've got a very focused agenda. Do you think it's going to work? And do you think it will actually put them on the world map, perhaps in a different way than they have been in years past?
Well, that should have been our first question. Instead of the last, we could have talked about that for an hour. They have something they call Vision 2030, which is a blueprint for social and economic change. And I think that clearly the social part of it is already working and has changed Saudi Arabia profoundly. The economic part is more complicated. To be very brief, the economic part wants to diversify the economy, balance the budget, and create jobs, basically. And those things take time. However, they are making progress. And we don't really go into a lot of detail, but they are making progress on that. They have. It's not a quick thing. It's not an easy thing to do, but I think they will succeed to an extent that allows them to remain stable. And I think that's I also, to be finally, it's going to take longer than 2030. If they had named their plan 2050, that would have been more realistic. But nobody would have cared. If they said the plan is 2050, everyone would say that's for my grandson to worry about, and I'm not going to get too excited. So they call it 2030, but I think realistically it's more like 2045. And I think they have a plan, and they have I think it's important to understand that they have very much a dynamic and quite aggressive leader who is pushing this thing hard.
Yes.
And that's a change. And he has created an infrastructure. He has reorganized the government. He has hired consultants. He has put in place monitoring systems. He has put in place key performance indicators. He has restricted money flows. And so unless you are doing something that is promoting 2030, you're not going to get funding. So there's now a much more focused agenda. So I think it probably will work.
And indeed, to help understand, the background in that, David's book is called Vision or Mirage, so a book well worth looking at. David Rondell, thank you so much for being with us. And Jennifer Stile, many books, The Woman Who Fell from the Sky, The Ambassador's Wife, and that other beautiful book too. We didn't get really around to talking to your book on, from Bolivia, but lots of interesting work there from both of you. And indeed also when we look at the diplomatic tightrope that you've managed to navigate all of these years and to bring us these great works of literature. We're really, really happy to have them. I want to thank you both so much. Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer and David.
Thank you so much.
And a big thank you, of course, to all of you for joining us at the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair. And also I'd like to thank the Arabic Language Centre for organising the book fair, and of course the AV team and all of our dear volunteers here, and our wonderful guest speakers who've made this a very informative and engaging session. Once again, thank you so much. And to our dear audience who showed up in person, and indeed to all of you online. Once again, thanks so much.
Thank you. So
Thank
Jennifer,
you.
Can you hear me?